My husband made me serve at his promotion party on the very day of my mother's funeral, mocking my tears in front of his guests. But when a mysterious man stepped out of the crowd and whispered the truth about my mother, the power in that room shifted forever. The morning my mother died, the world felt unreal in a way I had never experienced before. The air was too quiet, the light too sharp, every sound exaggerated as if reality itself had lost its balance. I remember standing in my childhood home, staring at the closed bedroom door where she had taken her last breath just hours earlier, waiting for something impossible to happen. For her to call my name, for the door to open, for the universe to admit it had made a mistake. Instead, my phone kept vibrating in my hand, pulling me back into a life that no longer fit the moment. It was my husband, Victor. I ignored the first call, then the second. By the third, habit overpowered grief, and I answered. His voice was brisk, irritated, already impatient. "Where are you?" he asked, as if I had missed a lunch appointment. I told him my mother was gone. There was a pause, just long enough to register the inconvenience. "Today," he said. "Yes," I whispered. "That's unfortunate," he replied, and then, as if reading from a schedule, added, "You know the promotion party is tonight." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My chest felt hollow, my throat too tight to form words. He sighed loudly. "Look, I'm sorry, but this is important. People are coming. Senior management. Clients. You need to be there." I thought I had misheard him. I told him there was a funeral. My mother's funeral. He was silent for a moment, then said the sentence that split something open inside me. "So what if her mother died?" "Stop crying and go serve." Serve. Not attend. Not support. Serve. Like a function. Like a role I was expected to perform regardless of circumstance. I hung up without responding and sank onto the floor, my back against the wall my mother had painted herself years ago. I cried until my body ached, until the grief became physical, until my aunt gently knocked and told me we needed to prepare. The funeral passed in a blur of black fabric, murmured condolences, and faces that looked at me with sympathy I didn't feel anymore. Victor didn't come. He sent a short text that read, "Running around today. See you tonight." By late afternoon, I stood in front of a mirror, dressed in the same black clothes I had worn to bury my mother, washing my face and forcing myself to breathe. I told myself I would survive the night, that I would go, do what was required, and leave. Survival had become my default setting in that marriage. The party was at a hotel ballroom, polished and bright, filled with laughter that felt obscene against the heaviness in my chest. Victor barely looked at me when I arrived. He gestured toward the service area and told me to help the staff. "It'll look good," he said. Supportive wife. Team player. I took a tray from a startled caterer and moved through the room as conversations floated past me. Promotions. Bonuses. Jokes about stress and sacrifice. No one knew that my mother had been buried just hours earlier. Or maybe they did and didn't care. Victor certainly didn't. Each step felt like an act of erasure. My grief reduced to an inconvenience. My presence repurposed to polish his image. I kept my head down, focusing on not dropping anything, on not crying. That was when I felt someone watching me. Not with curiosity or judgment, but with something heavier. Recognition. I turned and saw a man standing slightly apart from the crowd, older, composed, his eyes fixed on me with unsettling intensity. When our gazes met, his expression changed, as if he had found something he hadn't expected to see. He waited until I passed him again, then spoke softly, so softly I almost missed it. "You look just like her," he said. I stopped. My hands tightened around the tray. "Like who?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. He glanced toward Victor, laughing loudly at the center of the room, then back at me. "Your mother," he said, "and there's something you deserve to know about her." For a moment, I thought grief had finally tipped me into imagining things. People don't walk up to strangers at crowded parties and talk about their dead mothers with that kind of certainty. I stared at the man, searching his face for familiarity, and finding none, he looked out of place among the polished executives and their spouses, not because he was poorly dressed, but because he carried himself differently. Calm, grounded. as if the noise around him existed on a lower frequency he didn't need to engage with. I asked him how he knew my mother. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he nodded toward the tray in my hands and said gently, "You shouldn't be doing this today." The words almost broke me, not because they were dramatic, but because they were the first acknowledgement of my grief I'd heard all day. I swallowed hard and told him it wasn't his concern. He accepted that without offense, stepping aside to let me pass, but not before adding quietly, "When you're ready, I'll be near the window." I moved on, my heart pounding, my thoughts racing. I tried to tell myself he was mistaken, that he had confused me for someone else, that grief was making me vulnerable to projection. But every time I crossed the room, I felt his presence like a steady weight. Victor was in his element, holding court, basking in admiration. He didn't notice my distraction. He rarely did unless it inconvenienced him. An hour passed, maybe two. I lost track of time as the party wore on and the air grew stale. Eventually, I found myself near the window he'd mentioned, not because I had decided to talk to him, but because my body seemed to move there on its own. He was waiting, hands clasped loosely in front of him, gaze fixed on the city lights below. When I stopped a few feet away, he turned as if he'd sensed me approach. "My name is Elias," he said. "I knew your mother many years ago." I asked him where. He smiled faintly, not with nostalgia, but with respect. "Before she became who you knew," he said. "Before she learned how to disappear." That word caught my attention. Disappear. My mother had been many things, but invisible was not one of them. She had been warm, attentive, present in a way that anchored our small world. Elias seemed to read the confusion on my face. "I know this is not the time," he continued, "but there is never a good time for truth that's been buried." I asked him what he wanted. He met my gaze steadily. "I want you to know who your mother was before she chose a quieter life, and why people like your husband should never have been allowed to speak to you the way he does." My stomach tightened. I told him he was mistaken if he thought he understood my marriage. He didn't argue. He simply said, "Your mother would have recognized this situation immediately. She would have known exactly what kind of man Victor is." Hearing my husband's name spoken by a stranger sent a chill through me. I asked him how he knew that, too. Elias sighed softly. "Because men like Victor are predictable," he said, "and because your mother spent years teaching me how to see them." At that moment, Victor's laughter boomed across the room, loud and performative. Elias glanced toward him with something like disdain. "She would have hated this," he added. "Not the party. The way you're being used." I felt heat rise behind my eyes, but I refused to cry there, not in front of him, not in that room. I asked him what exactly he was implying. Elias reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim envelope. He didn't hand it to me immediately. "After the party," he said, "when you're not carrying someone else's expectations in your hands." I told him I didn't have time for games. He nodded. "Neither did your mother," he said. "That's why she made contingency plans." The word contingency echoed in my mind. My mother had always been practical, prepared, sometimes overly cautious. I had assumed it was anxiety. Now, I wondered if it had been experience. I asked Elias what kind of plans he meant. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "The kind you make when you know you're raising a daughter in a world that will try to break her spirit quietly." Before I could respond, Victor appeared beside me, his arms sliding possessively around my waist. "There you are," he said, smiling at Elias as if he were just another guest. "Everything okay?" Elias didn't flinch. He extended his hand. "Elias Moore," he said calmly, "an old friend of the family." Victor shook his hand, dismissive. "Didn't know we had family friends here," he said, his tone edged with irritation. Elias smiled faintly. "There are many things you don't know," he replied. Victor laughed, assuming it was a joke. "Well, enjoy the party," he said, steering me away without waiting for a response. As he pulled me back toward the crowd, he leaned in and hissed, "Stop wandering off. People are watching." I nodded automatically, my mind elsewhere. The rest of the evening passed in fragments. When the guests finally began to leave and the staff started clearing tables, Victor was flushed with success. He barely acknowledged me as he accepted congratulations and handshakes. Elias was gone. In his place, on a small table near the window, sat the envelope. My name was written on it in my mother's handwriting. The my hand was shaking as I picked up the envelope. For a moment, I simply stood there, staring at my name written in the familiar slant of my mother's handwriting, the same handwriting that had signed birthday cards, grocery lists, and the last note she'd left on the kitchen counter reminding me to eat properly. Seeing it here, in this place, felt impossible. My first instinct was to hide it, as if Victor might somehow sense its importance and take it from me. I slipped it into my bag just as he returned, energized and oblivious. "Finally," he said, loosening his tie. "That went well. Very well." He glanced around, then frowned. "Why do you still look like that? The night's over. Try smiling." I didn't answer. I followed him to the car in silence, my mind racing. During the drive home, he talked nonstop about the promotion, the connections he'd strengthened, the doors that were now open to him. He spoke as if this success belonged solely to him, as if I hadn't just buried my mother or spent the evenings serving drinks like an accessory. I stared out the window, feeling the envelope press against my side like a secret heartbeat. When we reached the apartment, Victor dropped onto the couch and kicked off his shoes. "I'm exhausted," he announced. "Don't wait up." He disappeared into the bedroom without another word. I stood alone in the living room, the silence heavy and unfamiliar. Slowly, deliberately, I took the envelope out of my bag and sat at the dining table. For a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it. It felt like crossing a line, like stepping into a part of my mother's life she had chosen not to share while she was alive. But the handwriting was undeniable. She had wanted me to read this. I broke the seal carefully and unfolded the letter inside. The first line made my breath catch. "My dearest daughter, if you're reading this, it means I am gone, and you are standing in a moment I hoped you would never have to face alone." Tears blurred the words, but I forced myself to continue. She wrote about choices she had made before I was born, about a life she had walked away from to protect me. She wrote about strength, about survival, about knowing when to be quiet and when to prepare. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "There is something you must know about who I was and what I left behind for you." I read on, my heart pounding. My mother had not always been the modest woman I knew. Before she married my father, before she built the small, careful life we shared, she'd been deeply involved in a business venture that had grown far beyond anything I could have imagined. She had been a founding partner, not an employee, not a bystander. When she chose to leave that world, she did not walk away empty-handed. She placed assets into a trust under another name, protecting them from people she no longer trusted and from a future she could not predict. That trust, she wrote, was now mine. I felt dizzy. The room seemed to tilt as I read the words again, certain I had misunderstood. She named the trust, the location of the documents, the attorney who had safeguarded everything for decades. Elias, she explained, had been her closest ally during that time, the one person who knew the full extent of what she had built and why she had chosen to disappear. He had promised to watch from a distance and to step in only if necessary. Apparently, he had decided that night was necessary. My mother's words grew more urgent toward the end of the letter. "I have seen the kind of man you married," she wrote. "Not because I disapproved of him openly, but because I recognized the signs. Control disguised as ambition. Cruelty masked by success. I stayed silent because you had to see it for yourself. But I did not leave you unprotected." I folded the letter slowly, my hands numb. Everything I thought I knew about my mother shifted in that moment. She hadn't been small or cautious by nature. She had been strategic. The quiet life she lived wasn't a limitation. It was a choice. I sat there until dawn, replaying memories with new understanding. The way she had insisted I keep my own account. The way she had told me never to rely completely on anyone else's version of security. The way she had watched Victor with a careful, unreadable expression whenever he spoke too loudly or dismissed me too casually. By morning, I felt hollow and strangely steady at the same time. Victor emerged from the bedroom, rubbing his eyes. "Why are you up so early?" he asked. I really looked at him, and saw how little he knew about me, about the woman he believed he controlled. "I couldn't sleep," I said evenly. He shrugged. You'll get over it, he replied, pouring himself coffee. Something in me settled then. I realized the humiliation of the party had not been the worst thing he'd done. The worst thing was that he believed I would always endure it. He was wrong. I slipped the letter back into my bag, my mother's words echoing in my mind. She had prepared for this moment long before I understood I would need it. And now, what I did, I spent the next few days moving through life as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. Victor returned to work riding the high of his promotion, leaving early and coming home late, his attention consumed by new responsibilities and the admiration that came with them. He barely noticed my silence, mistaking it for grief he assumed would fade on its own. In a way, he was right. Something was fading. Not my grief for my mother, but my tolerance for him. I contacted the attorney my mother had named in the letter, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. He confirmed everything with quiet professionalism, as if this revelation were long overdue. The trust existed. It had been carefully maintained for decades, and it was substantial in a way that made my stomach drop. My mother had not just protected a safety net. She had preserved a legacy. I met Elias again 2 days later in a quiet office far removed from the glittering spaces Victor favored. He didn't offer condolences or explanations. He simply answered questions. He told me about my mother as a strategist, a woman who understood power and chose to step away from it publicly without surrendering it privately. He told me she had watched my marriage unfold from the sidelines, hoping I would find my footing on my own, but ready to intervene if necessary. The promotion party, he said, had been the final signal. When Victor forced me to serve on the day of my mother's funeral, Elias knew my mother's worst fears had been realized. That night, I went home and watched Victor with new eyes. The way he spoke to me, the assumptions he made, the casual cruelty he no longer bothered to hide. He believed I was dependent. He believed grief had weakened me. He believed wrong. I didn't confront him. I didn't threaten or accuse. I began preparing quietly, the way my mother had taught without ever saying it aloud. I separated finances. I documented interactions. I learned the structure of the trust and the extent of my control. With each step, my fear receded, replaced by a calm resolve. Victor sensed something was off, but couldn't name it. He accused me once of being distant, of not supporting him the way a wife should. I looked at him and realized how hollow that role had become. I supported you, I said simply. You just didn't notice. The shift unsettled him. He was used to resistance, to tears or arguments. Clarity disarmed him. I waited, not out of hesitation, but out of strategy. My mother had waited years to protect me. I could wait a little longer to protect myself. The moment I truly understood how deeply Victor underestimated me came not with a grand confrontation, but with something far quieter. It was a Thursday evening, a week after the promotion party, and he came home later than usual, energized and impatient. He barely acknowledged me as he loosened his tie and scanned the apartment. We're hosting a dinner on Saturday, he said, already reaching for his phone. Some senior people from the regional office. I told them you'd handle it. The words landed heavily, not because they were new, but because for the first time, I didn't absorb them automatically. I didn't move. I didn't nod. I didn't ask what time. I simply looked at him and said, no. The word felt unfamiliar in my mouth, but also perfectly placed. Victor froze. He laughed once, sharply. What do you mean, no? He asked, as if the concept itself were absurd. I mean, I'm not hosting anything, I replied. I won't be here. His expression shifted from confusion to irritation. You're still emotional, he said dismissively. This isn't the time to act out. Act out, as if refusing unpaid labor were a tantrum. I felt something inside me click into alignment. I'm not acting, I said calmly. I'm deciding. He stared at me as if I'd spoken a foreign language. You don't get to decide things like this on your own, he snapped. My career is on the line. I thought of my mother, of the years she had spent watching quietly, preparing contingencies for a future she hoped I'd never need. I thought of the trust, of the freedom it represented. Then you should probably make different plans, I said. Victor's face reddened. You're being selfish, he said. After everything I've done for this family. I almost laughed. The entitlement in his voice was so naked, it was almost impressive. "What you've done," I replied evenly, "is assume I exist to make your life easier." The silence that followed was thick and unfamiliar. Victor had no script for this version of me. He stormed into the bedroom, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. I sat down at the table, my heart pounding, not with fear, but with adrenaline. Saying no had not destroyed anything. It had revealed it. The next day, he pretended the conversation hadn't happened. He left early, sent a curt text reminding me about the dinner, and returned home late, expecting compliance to fill the gap where discussion had failed. I didn't remind him. I didn't argue. I packed an overnight bag and made plans of my own. When Saturday arrived and he realized I was serious, the panic set in. Calls, messages, accusations. I didn't answer until the third call, and when I did, my voice was steady. "I told you I wouldn't be there," I said. "You should stop embarrassing yourself." That night, as I sat alone in a quiet hotel room, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. Not over him, but over myself. And once you taste that, everything changes. Victor came home that night long after midnight. I heard the door slam before I heard his footsteps, heavy and uneven, moving through the apartment with none of the careful restraint he used in public. I stayed seated at the table, the lamp on, a glass of water untouched in front of me. I wanted him to see that I wasn't hiding, that I wasn't afraid. He stopped short when he saw me, clearly not expecting calm. "Do you have any idea what you did tonight?" he demanded, his voice tight with rage and humiliation. I looked up at him slowly. "Yes," I said. I honored myself. That answer broke whatever fragile control he had left. He accused me of sabotaging him, of humiliating him in front of people who mattered, of being ungrateful for the life he had given me. The words spilled out fast, rehearsed grievances finally given permission to surface. I listened without interrupting, noticing how quickly his anger shifted into something sharper when he realized I wasn't reacting. He stepped closer, looming, his voice dropping. "You think you can just decide things now?" he said. "You think you have some kind of power?" I met his gaze evenly. "I know I do," I replied. The certainty in my voice startled him. For a moment, he looked unsure, as if sensing that something fundamental had changed without understanding what it was. Then his expression hardened. "You're nothing without me," he said quietly, aiming for the place he believed would hurt most. The insult would have devastated me once. Now it landed flat. I saw it for what it was, not a truth, but a confession of fear. "That's not true," I said. "It's just convenient for you to believe." He scoffed, turning away, muttering about ingratitude and loyalty. When he finally retreated to the bedroom, slamming the door behind him, I sat alone with the echo of his words and felt nothing like doubt. Instead, I felt clarity. This was the man he had always been when stripped of admiration and compliance. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened, humming in the kitchen, checking his phone, avoiding my eyes. The switch was almost impressive. He believed conflict could be erased by ignoring it. I let him believe that. I had already contacted a lawyer, quietly, efficiently, using the name my mother had trusted. The consultation was brief and precise. Options were laid out. Timelines explained. Protections established. I left the office feeling steady, not rushed. At home, Victor continued performing normalcy, making plans, issuing expectations. I responded with neutrality, neither agreeing nor arguing. The effect was immediate. His confidence wavered. He began asking questions, circling me like someone who sensed danger but couldn't locate it. "Are you talking to someone?" he asked one evening. "About what?" I replied. "About us." I paused just long enough to let the silence stretch. "We don't need to talk about everything," I said. That sentence haunted him. I could see it in the way he watched me, the way he flinched when my phone buzzed, the way his authority evaporated without resistance to push against. The mask had slipped, and he knew it. He just didn't know how much I had already seen. Once Victor realized that anger no longer worked, he shifted strategies. The aggression softened into something more calculated, a version of charm he hadn't used in years. He brought home flowers without explanation, offered to cook dinner, spoke to me with exaggerated politeness, as if courtesy could overwrite contempt. I recognized the pattern immediately. This was the man he became when control was slipping, when he needed to restore equilibrium without admitting fault. I accepted the gestures without comment, not because they mattered, but because my response mattered more than his effort. Gratitude would have rewarded him. Rejection would have provoked him. Neutrality left him guessing. And guessing, I learned, was unbearable for someone who thrived on certainty. He began asking indirect questions, fishing for reassurance without exposing vulnerability. "You seem different lately," he said one evening, watching me from across the room. More distant. I looked up from my book. "I'm tired," I said simply. It wasn't a lie. I was tired of translating myself into something smaller. He nodded, unsatisfied. "We've been through a lot," he continued. "It's normal to lean on each other." The implication was clear. "Lean back. Resume your position." I closed the book and met his gaze. "I'm leaning on myself right now," I said. The silence that followed was heavy, charged. He laughed it off, but the sound was brittle. That night, he slept restlessly, turning and sighing, while I lay awake calm and alert. The shift in power wasn't loud or dramatic. It was cumulative. Every unanswered question, every boundary held without explanation, every expectation unmet chipped away at the illusion he had built his authority on. He began monitoring my movements, not overtly, but enough for me to notice. He asked where I was going. He commented on how long I'd been gone. He watched my phone with poorly concealed interest. I didn't hide anything. I didn't need to. Transparency offered without permission is disarming. The more he tried to read me, the more unreadable I became. Meanwhile, I continued preparing quietly. Documents were copied. Accounts were reviewed. Contingencies were mapped. I didn't rush. My mother's voice echoed in my memory, not as words, but as example. Preparation is not paranoia when it's rooted in experience. Elias checked in once, briefly, to ask if I was safe. I told him I was. That was enough. Victor's frustration eventually boiled over in smaller, more revealing ways. A sharp comment here, a sarcastic remark there. Attempts to provoke a reaction he could label unreasonable. I gave him none. When he accused me of withholding affection, I told him affection isn't owed. When he accused me of being secretive, I told him privacy isn't betrayal. Each response was calm, precise, impossible to argue with without exposing entitlement. He began to unravel publicly, snapping at colleagues, missing details, overcompensating in ways that drew attention. I heard about it secondhand, not because I asked, but because people notice when someone's composure starts to crack. The man who had once commanded rooms was now visibly unsettled. And still I waited, not because I doubted myself, but because I understood the value of timing. Power isn't just about action. It's about choosing when to act. Victor, meanwhile, was running out of guesses. And the less he knew, the more he revealed. The moment Victor stopped guessing and started demanding answers was the moment I knew the end was near. He came home one evening earlier than usual, his movements sharp, his jaw tight with barely contained frustration. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "You're hiding something," he said, standing in the doorway as if blocking my escape. I closed my laptop slowly and looked at him. "We've already established that I'm allowed to have privacy," I replied. That only fueled him. "This isn't privacy," he snapped. "This is you planning something behind my back." I studied his face, seeing fear beneath the anger, the realization that he was no longer in control of the narrative. "You planned plenty behind my back," I said evenly. "I learned from the best." The words landed harder than I expected. He flinched, then recovered, pacing the room like a caged animal. "This has gone far enough," he said. "We need to talk. Now." I nodded once. "We will," I said. "Just not on your schedule." That was when he lost it. His voice rose, accusations tumbling over one another, each more desperate than the last. He accused me of disrespect, of disloyalty, of trying to ruin him. I let him speak until he ran out of breath. When he finally stopped, I stood up, my movements calm and deliberate. "You forced me to serve drinks on the day of my mother's funeral," I said quietly. That was the day this ended. Everything since then has just been you catching up. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, as if the memory had finally pierced whatever justification he'd built around it. I reached into my bag and placed the letter on the table between us. My mother left me something, I continued. Not just money. Perspective. His eyes flicked to the envelope, then back to me. What is that? He demanded. Proof, I said simply. Proof of who she was. Proof of what she saw in you. Proof that I'm not as powerless as you believed. He laughed nervously. You're bluffing, he said. You wouldn't dare. I met his gaze steadily. I already have. The color drained from his face as I explained, in measured terms, what my mother had built, what she had protected, and what now belonged to me. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't threaten. I stated facts. With each one, his certainty eroded. He asked questions I didn't answer. He demanded details I didn't know him. When he finally understood that this wasn't a story he could interrupt or redirect, his posture changed. The arrogance slipped, replaced by calculation. We can work something out, he said, lowering his voice. There's no reason to make this messy. I almost smiled. You made it messy the day you decided my grief was an inconvenience, I replied. I'm just cleaning up. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The truth was no longer hidden, no longer mine alone to carry. Victor didn't sleep at all. The days after the truth surfaced were marked by a strange, brittle quiet. Victor moved through the apartment like someone afraid of making noise in a house that might collapse if he breathed too loudly. The confidence that had once filled every room he entered was gone, replaced by a careful watchfulness that bordered on panic. He tried to pretend nothing had changed, but the effort showed. He asked fewer questions now, not because curiosity had faded, but because he was afraid of the answers. I, on the other hand, felt lighter with every passing hour. The burden of secrecy had been replaced by something far more stable: inevitability. Victor tested the boundaries once more, as if hoping I might flinch. He suggested counseling, framing it as a mutual effort, ignoring the fact that he had mocked my grief and exploited my silence. I told him counseling only works when both people believe the relationship is worth saving. He asked if I did. I didn't answer immediately. Silence, at that point, said more than words ever could. He began bargaining next. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with small concessions offered too late. He volunteered to take on household responsibilities he'd never touched. He spoke about future trips, about rebuilding trust, about the kind of husband he could become if given the chance. I listened politely, recognizing each offer for what it was: fear disguised as growth. The man sitting across from me wasn't transformed. He was cornered. That distinction mattered. Meanwhile, his professional life began to reflect the cracks in his personal one. He stayed later at the office, not out of dedication, but avoidance. When he came home, he was distracted, irritable, quick to snap at imagined slights. He was unraveling in slow motion, and for the first time, I didn't feel responsible for holding him together. One evening, he accused me of enjoying this, of taking satisfaction in watching him struggle. The accusation surprised me with its honesty. I'm not enjoying it, I said calmly. I'm just no longer protecting you from the consequences of your choices. He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The next morning, I filed for divorce. Not dramatically, not as an ultimatum. I simply did it. The papers were delivered while he was at work, a procedural detail that stripped the moment of spectacle. When he came home that evening, the envelope was waiting on the table. He stared at it for a long time before opening it, as if hoping it might disappear if he delayed long enough. When he finally read it, his shoulders sagged. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He asked one question, quietly. When did you decide? I thought about my mother's funeral, about the party, about the tray in my hands, and the weight of humiliation settling into my bones. I decided the day you told me to stop crying and go serve. I answered. He nodded slowly, absorbing that truth with the dull resignation of someone who knew, too late, exactly where he had gone wrong. That night, he slept on the couch. The following weeks passed with clinical efficiency. Lawyers communicated. Assets were listed. Timelines were set. Victor oscillated between cooperation and quiet resentment, but he no longer had the energy to fight. The narrative he had built about himself as the deserving hero of his own story had collapsed, and without it, he seemed smaller, diminished. I moved through the process with steady focus, guided by preparation rather than emotion. Elias checked in once more, offering support if I needed it. I thanked him and told him I was fine. I'm in it. My mother's presence felt closer than ever, not as absence, but as influence. I understood now why she had lived the way she had, why she had chosen discretion over display. She had known that true security isn't loud. It's layered. On the day Victor moved out, he paused at the door, looking back as if searching for something to salvage. "You've changed," he said quietly. I nodded. "So have you," I replied. The difference was I had changed by choice. He left without another word. As the door closed behind him, I felt no surge of triumph, no rush of vindication. I felt completion, the kind that doesn't need witnesses. My mother's funeral had been the day I was denied the right to grieve. It was also the day something far more enduring began. I had lost her, but in losing her, I had found the strength she had quietly prepared me to claim. And that strength was finally, unmistakably, my own. After Victor left, the apartment felt unfamiliar in a way that surprised me. Not empty, but open. The rooms seemed to breathe differently, as if they had been waiting for permission to exist without tension. I moved through the space slowly, noticing details I had once overlooked, the way light fell across the floor in the afternoon, the quiet hum of the city outside the windows. For years, I had lived in a constant state of adjustment, calibrating myself to someone else's moods and expectations. Now, there was nothing to calibrate against. The silence was not something to fill. It was something to inhabit. Friends reached out cautiously, unsure of what version of me they would encounter. I understood their hesitation. I was still learning that myself. When they asked how I was doing, I answered honestly but simply. I told them I was steady. That word seemed to confuse people. They expected anger or relief, devastation or triumph. Steadiness didn't fit the narrative they were prepared to engage with. I let that be their discomfort, not mine. In the weeks that followed, I took care of practical matters with the same quiet focus that had carried me through the separation. I reorganized my finances, moved funds into accounts solely under my control, and reviewed the trust documents in full. The scale of what my mother had left me became clearer with each conversation, but it no longer felt shocking. It felt intentional. She hadn't wanted to overwhelm me with abundance. She had wanted to equip me with autonomy. That distinction shaped how I chose to use it. I didn't rush to change my lifestyle or prove anything to anyone. I made small, deliberate choices that reinforced independence rather than spectacle. I invested in stability, in education, in causes that reflected values my mother had lived by quietly. Each decision felt like a conversation with her, a continuation rather than a departure. Elias and I met one final time, not to discuss logistics, but to share a simple acknowledgement. He told me my mother would have been proud of how I handled everything, not because I had confronted Victor, but because I had waited until I was clear. She believed clarity was the most dangerous thing a woman could possess, he said. I understood what he meant. Clarity strips away excuses. It leaves no room for manipulation, including the kind we direct at ourselves. As my life settled into a new rhythm, I noticed how my standards had shifted. I no longer tolerated dismissiveness or entitlement, not because I was guarded, but because I recognized them instantly. I chose relationships that felt reciprocal, environments that respected boundaries without needing explanation. The lessons my mother had embedded into my life through preparation rather than instruction surfaced naturally. I trusted myself in a way I never had before. That trust was the true inheritance. Sometimes I thought back to that night in the hotel ballroom, carrying trays through a room that didn't see me, my grief compressed into something manageable for other people's comfort. I realized how close I had come to internalizing that erasure as normal. My mother's intervention, through Elias and the letter she'd written years earlier, had interrupted that pattern at exactly the right moment. Not to save me from pain, but to ensure I didn't mistake endurance for worth. I didn't romanticize what I'd been through. Loss was still loss. Grief still arrived in waves, unexpected and sharp, but it no longer defined me or dictated my choices. I let it exist without letting it decide. That, too, was something my mother had understood. In the end, the secret Elias revealed wasn't just about money or hidden assets. It was about lineage, about the quiet strength passed from one woman to another, not through speeches or warnings, but through preparation and trust. My mother had trusted me to step into myself when the time came. That trust changed everything. I carried it forward, not as armor, but as grounding. Whatever came next in my life, I knew I would meet it without shrinking, without rushing, and without surrendering my right to be fully human, even in grief. The day my husband told me to stop crying and go serve had been meant to humiliate me. Instead, it became the day I began serving myself a life my mother had always hoped I would claim. In the months that followed, I discovered that real strength doesn't announce itself when everything is falling apart. It reveals itself afterward, in the quiet consistency of how you live once the chaos has passed. My days became simpler, not because my life had shrunk, but because it no longer revolved around managing someone else's ego. I woke up without bracing myself. I made decisions without rehearsing explanations. I noticed how much energy that freed up, how much mental space had once been consumed by anticipating reactions that no longer mattered. That space didn't stay empty for long. I filled it with things that felt honest. Long walks without headphones. Books I had meant to read for years, but never had the patience for. Conversations that didn't require me to edit myself mid-sentence. I began to recognize how often I had mistaken tension for passion, control for stability. Without Victor's constant presence, those distortions faded. What remained was clarity, steady and unremarkable, but profoundly grounding. People around me began to comment on the change, though they struggled to articulate it. They said I seemed calmer, more centered, harder to rush. Some admired it. Others found it unsettling. I understood both reactions. When you stop performing urgency, it disrupts people who rely on it. I didn't explain myself. I didn't need to. My life spoke quietly for itself. Victor tried once more to re-enter the narrative, sending a message framed as concern. He asked if I was doing well, if the transition had been difficult, if there was anything he could help with. I read it without reaction and didn't respond. Not out of bitterness, but because the chapter was complete. Engagement would have been a step backward, an invitation to reopen something that no longer required attention. That decision felt natural, not forced. Closure had arrived without ceremony. The trust my mother had left me continued to shape my choices in subtle ways. It allowed me to approach the future without fear, but it also demanded responsibility. I didn't see it as a safety net to fall back on, but as a foundation to build from. I made investments carefully, aligning resources with values rather than appearances. Each choice reinforced a lesson my mother had lived by. True security is quiet, layered, and patient. Elias faded from my life as naturally as he had entered it. His role had been precise, and once fulfilled, it required no extension. I was grateful for his presence, but even more grateful for my mother's foresight. She had known I wouldn't listen to warnings spoken too early. She had trusted timing over instruction. That trust honored me in a way nothing else could have. Grief still visited me, especially in small, unexpected moments. A scent, a song, a phrase she used to say. I welcomed it without resistance, understanding now that grief is not something to overcome, but something to carry differently over time. It no longer felt like a weight. It felt like connection. The humiliation I had endured at the promotion party receded into memory, stripped of its power. It no longer defined me. If anything, it stood as a marker of contrast, a clear line between who I had been and who I refused to be again. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't need to. Living well, on my own terms, without shrinking or apologizing, was enough. As I moved forward, I carried one certainty with me. I would never again allow my grief to be treated as an inconvenience, my labor as an obligation, or my silence as consent. Those boundaries were no longer negotiable. They were simply part of who I was. The strength my mother had passed down wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't require confrontation to exist. It stayed. It guided. It waited when waiting was necessary and acted when action was clear. And it reminded me, in every choice I made, that dignity is not something anyone can give or take away. It is something you claim by deciding, again and again, not to abandon yourself. There are moments in life when you realize that what felt like an ending was actually an initiation. I came to understand that slowly, in the ordinary days that followed the unraveling of my marriage. Nothing dramatic announced the shift. No grand opportunity arrived with perfect timing. Instead, there was a quiet sense of alignment that settled into my bones and stayed there. I stopped questioning myself in ways I once considered normal. Decisions came more easily, not because they were simpler, but because I trusted the place they came from. That trust was my mother's final gift, more valuable than anything written into a trust or documented in a letter. I began to see how deliberately she had lived, how carefully she had shaped her life, not around fear, but around foresight. She hadn't hidden her past out of shame. She had protected it out of wisdom. The world she stepped away from was one that demanded constant performance and compromise, and she had chosen something quieter, something safer for raising a daughter she hoped would one day choose freely. I honored that choice not by replicating her life, but by embodying the principles that guided it. I no longer rushed to fill silence or smooth tension. I let conversations breathe. I let people reveal themselves without interruption. That alone changed the quality of every interaction I had. Those who respected boundaries stayed. Those who resented them drifted away. The sorting happened naturally, without confrontation or explanation. I found myself drawn to work that required thoughtfulness rather than speed, to environments where patience was a strength rather than a liability. The skills I had honed in waiting served me well. I could assess situations without being swept up in them. I could pause without losing momentum. I could act decisively when clarity arrived, knowing it was earned. Occasionally, I thought about the version of myself who had carried trays through a hotel ballroom on the day she buried her mother, swallowing grief to make someone else comfortable. I felt tenderness toward her now, not anger. She had survived long enough for transformation to be possible. That mattered. I didn't frame my story as a cautionary tale or a triumph. It didn't need a moral to be valid. It simply needed to be lived honestly. The mysterious man who approached me that night had revealed a secret. Yes, but the deeper revelation came later. My mother had never intended to rescue me. She had intended to remind me who I was when the world tried to make me forget. That reminder arrived at the exact moment I was ready to receive it. I carried that awareness in everything that followed. When faced with choices that once would have terrified me, I remembered that urgency often belongs to those who benefit from your confusion. I waited when waiting was wise. I acted when action was clear. I walked away when staying required self-erasure. Those decisions accumulated into a life that felt coherent, grounded. I didn't need applause or validation. I needed integrity, the kind that shows up quietly, day after day, in how you treat yourself when no one is watching. My mother's funeral had been the day I was told to stop crying and go serve. It was also the day I stopped abandoning myself to keep peace. The secret revealed that night didn't just change my circumstances. It changed my posture toward the world. I no longer moved through it apologetically or cautiously. I moved through it awake. And that, I realized, was the legacy she had intended all along. The strange thing about reclaiming yourself is that it doesn't feel dramatic once it's done. There is no soundtrack, no moment where the world pauses to acknowledge what you've survived. Life simply continues, and you continue with it, but from a different place. Stronger, quieter, more awake. I noticed it most in how I handled situations that once would have shaken me. A difficult conversation no longer sent my heart racing. A raised voice no longer made me shrink. Disappointment no longer felt like a verdict on my worth. People sometimes asked if I missed being married. They expected bitterness or relief, something easily categorized. What I felt was more complex. I missed the version of myself I thought I was building toward a shared future. I did not miss the cost. I did not miss the silencing, the minimizing, the constant pressure to be convenient. I had learned the difference between companionship and captivity, and once you see that difference clearly, you can't unsee it. Victor faded into memory the way storms do once the damage is assessed and repaired. Occasionally, I heard updates through distant channels. His promotion had lost its shine. The people who once applauded him moved on to the next rising star. Without someone absorbing the emotional fallout of his failures, his life grew harsher, louder, more brittle. I felt no satisfaction in that. It wasn't my victory. It was simply consequence unfolding without interference. What stayed with me was my mother, not as an absence, but as a presence woven into my choices. I heard her in my restraint, in my patience, in my refusal to rush toward false peace. I understood now why she had lived the way she had, why she had chosen discretion over display, preparation over confrontation. She had known something I was only beginning to grasp, that the most powerful form of protection is not force, but foresight. The mysterious man who approached me at the party had been a messenger, nothing more. The real inheritance was internal. It was the ability to wait without weakening, to act without frenzy, to walk away without apology. Those skills reshaped my life more thoroughly than any asset ever could. They influenced the work I chose, the people I trusted, the standards I refused to negotiate. I built a life that no longer required me to disappear in order for someone else to shine. I built it carefully, deliberately, honoring the lessons that had arrived through grief rather than comfort. I didn't rush happiness. I let it emerge naturally, in moments of peace, in laughter that felt unforced, in mornings that didn't begin with dread. The day my husband told me to stop crying and go serve had been meant to put me in my place. Instead, it revealed how misplaced I had been all along. It took loss to wake me. It took humiliation to clarify me. And it took my mother's quiet wisdom, delivered at exactly the right moment, to remind me that my life was always meant to be my own. This story doesn't end with revenge or reconciliation. It ends with something far more enduring. Self-respect. The kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand recognition, doesn't need permission. The kind that simply lives on, steady and unyielding, long after the noise fades. And that is where it truly ends. The last thing I learned, long after everything else had settled, was that closure doesn't arrive with certainty. It arrives with acceptance. Not the kind that excuses what happened, but the kind that no longer requires you to revisit it in order to understand yourself. I stopped replaying conversations in my head. I stopped wondering how things might have turned out if I had spoken sooner or left earlier. Those questions lost their urgency because they no longer served me. The woman asking them had already moved on. Life didn't become perfect. It became honest. There were still difficult days, moments when grief resurfaced unexpectedly, when I wished I could hear my mother's voice one more time. But those moments no longer destabilized me. They reminded me of where I came from and why I refused to abandon myself again. Grief and strength learned to coexist. One no longer canceled out the other. I realized that many people spend their lives waiting for permission to choose themselves. Permission from partners, from family, from society. My mother had understood something rare. Permission is never given. It is taken quietly, through preparation, through patience, through the refusal to shrink. She had taken hers long before I was born, and when the time came, she handed it to me without fanfare. The night I was forced to serve at a party meant to celebrate someone who didn't see me, I thought I had reached my lowest point. I hadn't. I had reached my turning point. Everything that followed grew from that moment, not in spite of it. I no longer needed to prove anything about my resilience or my worth. I lived them instead. If there is one truth that remains, it is this. The people who try to silence you during your grief are often terrified of what you might become if you were allowed to feel it fully. My husband feared my grief because it interrupted his narrative. But grief didn't weaken me. It stripped away illusions. It revealed the inheritance my mother had left me long before she died. Not money, not protection, but the certainty that my life was always mine to claim. And so it ended, not loudly, not publicly, but correctly, with me standing firmly in myself, no longer serving anyone else's comfort at the expense of my own humanity.